So here we're going to be looking at the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system is actually really closely related to the cardiovascular system and other systems, but mostly the cardiovascular system and the digestive system, and we'll talk about that, why that is in a second. The respiratory system has two main functions, which you probably already realize since we just finished the cardiovascular system. So the respiratory system takes in oxygen. Let me change my color here, from the atmosphere. So oxygen, you have to remember, is needed for all cellular respiration, and it removes carbon dioxide and water. So it takes in oxygen from the atmosphere. It removes carbon dioxide and water. Cellular respiration is not the respiration that we know of as breathing. It's the process that you should have gone over last year, but it's the process where cells take in oxygen and glucose in order to produce energy, and in that process they release carbon dioxide and they eliminate some water also through your lungs. So the respiratory system works closely with the digestive system because the respiratory system provides the oxygen needed in cellular respiration, whereas the digestive system provides the glucose needed in cellular respiration. And the role of the circulatory system is to make sure that these two are brought to the cells in order for the cells to use it as energy. So again, just to summarize, respiratory system takes in oxygen from the atmosphere that's needed for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration will take in the oxygen and the glucose from the digestive system. We'll use it for energy, and we'll release carbon dioxide and water through the lungs. Now, as the air is taken in from our environment, it actually passes through a number of structures before it actually gets to the lungs. And these structures are actually there for a particular purpose, and they serve a purpose. And we'll start with the nose. Now, the nose has cells within your nasal lining. There are cells that produce mucus. And we talked about mucus when we talked about the digestive system. And it pretty much has a similar function. So it's a sticky material, and what it does is it moistens the air, which means it adds some humidity, I guess, or some liquid to the air in order to keep your nose from drying out. And you'll probably remember that whenever you have a cold and you're always blowing your nose and you're getting rid of that mucus, your nose may dry out because you're continuously getting rid of that mucus. You do need some of that in your nose to keep it moist. And the other thing with mucus is that it traps particles like dust, things that we don't really see in the air, but when we breathe them in, they might irritate our lungs. So mucus's role is to make sure that that dust or those particles don't get to your lungs. They're trapped in your nose, and they're either sneezed out, or when you blow your nose, they'll be in your tissue, or it'll end up in your pharynx, and you may swallow it, and it'll end up in your stomach. Another thing found on the cells of the nose are cilia. Same kind of cilia in the small intestine. And basically they act in a sweeping motion. So they sweep mucus to the back of your mouth, to your throat, where you can swallow it, and again, it ends up in your stomach. Sneezing is not necessarily an indication that you're sick. Sneezing is basically just your body's reaction to having some sort of foreign particle in your nose. It's actually a protective mechanism. So if your body senses that there's some sort of dust or particle that shouldn't be going into your lungs, you'll sneeze to try to get that particle out. The pharynx, or the throat, is where the nose and mouth connect. There's a typo here. So where the nose and mouth connect. And this is called the pharynx. So it's where the digestive system and the respiratory system meet. The trachea is basically your windpipe. So food enters your pharynx, it goes into the esophagus. Air enters your pharynx, it goes into the trachea. And it's actually made up of cartilage, rings of cartilage. And the purpose of that is to strengthen the trachea, make sure it doesn't collapse, and to always keep it open. And like the nose, the trachea contains cilia that release mucus, and they act in an upward direction to try to get the mucus out of the lungs. Okay, so they protect your lungs, and if any particles got through your nose, when they get to your trachea, they'll be trapped by the mucus, and then the cilia will kind of sweep them out of the trachea into your pharynx while you're either maybe spit it out, cough it out, or you'll swallow it and it'll go into your stomach. And speaking of coughing, like a sneeze, it helps get rid of particles that irritate the lining of the trachea. The epiglottis is another protective mechanism at the opening of the trachea. It prevents any food from entering your windpipe. If food does enter your windpipe, your body's reaction is to cough, to try to cough it out. So it's a protective mechanism. The bronchi, or the bronchus, singular, are passages that lead to the lung. They're divisions of the trachea, and they actually divide into smaller and smaller tubes that kind of look like a tree. So, and if we look at our diagram, okay, so the trachea here will divide into the bronchus, or bronchi, okay, and then they'll divide further, and we'll look at that in another diagram, until they become alveoli, which are like grapes. And that's where oxygen exchange or gas exchange takes place. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's fill out this guy. You can use your textbook, although this is a little bit more detailed than your textbook, so you're responsible for this diagram. So we'll start up here with the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. So nasal cavity, oral cavity. Cavity is basically I guess you can say an opening. So your nose will lead into your nasal cavity. Your oral cavity is your mouth. This will lead into the pharynx, which is here. So we talked about that, the meeting point between respiratory and digestive systems. We'll go down the pharynx. Your larynx is also referred to as your voice box. We didn't really talk about it when we looked at all the structures, but you do need to know that the larynx is your voice box. Trachea is remember the tube that leads into your lungs. So we have the right bronchus, and like we said before, it separates into right and left bronchi, and it goes into your right lung and left lung. You'll notice in the picture and other pictures you might see that the right lung has 3 lobes, or 3 leaves, I guess. The left lung has 2. Don't really need to know that. I just thought I would mention it. So here we have the left bronchus. Don't worry about this. This is it's also part of the bronchus. I don't know why they added that. Left lung and the diaphragm, which plays a huge role in the breathing movements. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now this video is getting a little longer than I hoped, so I'm going to quickly go over how it is that we breathe, and then we'll talk about it more in class. The main thing about this is that it's all about the diaphragm. The diaphragm works very closely with the rib muscles to contract. They lift the chest wall, the wall of the chest up, and at the same time the diaphragm contracts, it moves downwards, and this motion causes an increase in the amount of space in your chest, which causes the air to fill into your chest. Now let's look at that with our little video here. So here we can see how the diaphragm, which is this here, so that how the diaphragm contracts. Now the ribs are going to come out in a second. And then here we see, so when the diaphragm contracts downwards, air rushes in. And you could see the heart pumping at the same time. Now she's running, which is why it's pumping harder, and she's breathing harder. Okay, so your diaphragm, look at the movement of the diaphragm. It contracts, it moves down, making more space in the chest. Here we go. So it's making more space in the chest. And that way it allows air to move in. Now, if we look at this more closely, if we look at the lungs and the diaphragm more closely, you can really see this. So you can see as the diaphragm contracts, the volume of the chest increases, allowing air in, and as the diaphragm relaxes, it decreases the volume of the chest cavity and air rushes out. We will continue to look at this in a lot more detail this week.